What happens when a quiet act of injustice meets an unstoppable force of will? You're about to hear the story of a man who was told he didn't belong, a man whose dignity was stripped away at 30,000 feet in front of a plane full of strangers. But this man wasn't just any passenger. He was Julian Vance, a CEO who controls a budget that could make or break an airline. When Ascendair chose to humiliate him for the comfort of another passenger, they didn't just lose a customer. They ignited a firestorm. This isn't just a story about revenge. It's about how one man's quiet resolve froze a $120 million contract and triggered a corporate reckoning that sent shockwaves through an entire industry. Stay tuned. The soft, buttery leather of Seat 2A enveloped Julian Vance like a well-deserved embrace. It was the culmination of a grueling week of negotiations in New York, and the 9-hour flight to London on Ascendair's flagship Boeing 727 was his decompression chamber. As the CEO of Nexus Dynamics, a global technology consulting firm that had essentially written the playbook for modern logistics and supply chain management, Julian's life was a meticulously scheduled symphony of high-stakes meetings, data analysis, and cross-continental travel. He didn't fly first class for the champagne, though the glass of Dom Perignon currently sweating on his polished wood-grain console was appreciated. He flew it for the solitude and the efficiency, the ability to work without interruption and arrive rested, ready for the next corporate battle. He was a man who commanded attention without ever demanding it. Dressed in a simple but impeccably tailored gray travel blazer over a black cashmere sweater, he exuded a quiet authority that was far more potent than boisterous displays of wealth. At 45, Julian had built Nexus Dynamics from a two-person startup in a Silicon Valley garage into a corporate titan with 50,000 employees worldwide. His face, a familiar sight on the covers of Forbes and Wired, was calm and thoughtful. He was a chess player in a world of checkers, always thinking 5 moves ahead. The first-class cabin was beginning to fill. The low hum of whispered conversations and the gentle clinking of glasses created a serene atmosphere. Julian had already placed his briefcase, containing the final signed contracts from the New York deal, securely in the overhead bin. His laptop was open, but he wasn't working yet. He was people-watching, a habit from his leaner days that helped him read rooms and understand motivations. That's when he first noticed her. The lead flight attendant, a woman in her late 50s with a severe blonde bob and a name tag that read Carol, moved through the cabin with an air of proprietary ownership. She smiled brightly, almost dazzlingly, at a silver-haired man in a Savile Row suit. But when her eyes passed over Julian, the smile faltered, becoming a tight, professional mask. It was a micro-expression, a flicker of something he couldn't quite name, but had felt 1,000 times before. It was the look of someone recalibrating their expectations downwards. He'd seen it in boardrooms when he was the only black man at the table, in restaurants where the host assumed he was in the wrong place. He had hoped, foolishly perhaps, that in Seat 2A of an international first-class flight, he might be insulated from it. He dismissed the thought, attributing it to fatigue. He returned his attention to his screen, flagging emails for his team to handle while he was in the air. The boarding process continued. A few minutes later, Carol's voice, sharp and laced with a false sweetness, cut through his concentration. "Excuse me, sir." Julian looked up. She was standing beside his seat, her smile as brittle as spun sugar. Beside her stood a flustered-looking white man in his 60s, clutching a boarding pass. "I'm sorry," Carol began, not sounding sorry at all. "But it appears there's been a small mix-up with the seating." Julian glanced at his own boarding pass, which he'd tucked into the seat pocket. Flight ARA 121, New York to London. Seat 2A. He'd booked it 6 weeks ago. "A mix-up?" he asked, his voice even and calm. "Yes," she said, her gaze flicking from Julian to the other passenger, a man who seemed to be deliberately avoiding eye contact. "It seems this gentleman, Mr. Davenport, was assigned this seat. The system can be so finicky sometimes." She let out a small, tinkling laugh that didn't reach her eyes. Julian held his ground. He knew a double booking was possible, though rare in the meticulously managed world of first-class travel. "I believe you'll find my boarding pass confirms this is my assigned seat," he said politely, gesturing toward the pocket. Perhaps you could check Mr. Davenport's pass against the manifest? Carol's smile tightened further. Sir, we've already looked at the situation. Mr. Davenport is one of our Platinum Premier members. He's been sitting in this seat for 20 years. The implication was clear. Mr. Davenport's history superseded Julian's present reality. The sheer absurdity of the statement, as if a passenger could homestead a seat on an airplane, was not lost on Julian. This was no longer about a technical glitch. This was about something else. He could feel the eyes of the other first-class passengers turning towards him. The quiet hum of the cabin had been replaced by a tense silence. He was becoming a spectacle. I appreciate Mr. Davenport's loyalty to the airline, Julian said, his voice dropping slightly, losing its polite edge and gaining a core of steel. However, this seat was assigned to me for this flight. I am also a top-tier frequent flyer with your airline alliance. I'm sure a quick look at the manifest will clear this up. He was giving her an out, a chance to de-escalate, to blame a computer, to save face. She refused to take it. Instead, Carol leaned in closer, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper that was somehow more insulting than a shout. Sir, perhaps you would be more comfortable in one of the seats in our premium economy cabin. It's very spacious and we can offer you a travel voucher for the inconvenience. The mask fell away. The offer of a downgrade, a pittance of a voucher, was the true insult. It wasn't about a seating error, it was a judgment. In her eyes, he was the one who was out of place. He, Julian Vance, CEO of a multi-billion-dollar company, was being told he didn't belong in a seat he had paid for, a seat he had earned 1,000 times over, simply because his presence conflicted with the perceived entitlement of the man standing next to him. Mr. Davenport, for his part, finally spoke, a weak, reedy voice. I always sit here. My assistant books it. Julian looked from Davenport's entitled confusion to Carol's smug certainty. He saw the entire dynamic laid bare, the unspoken rules, the quiet biases that grease the wheels of the world for some and throw sand in the gears for others. And in that moment, a cold, crystalline anger began to form in his chest. It was an anger he hadn't felt in years, an anger he thought his success had insulated him from. He had been wrong. No, Julian said, his voice quiet but echoing in the silent cabin. I will not be more comfortable in premium economy. I will be comfortable right here, in the seat assigned to me. Please check your manifest. Carol's face hardened. The faux sweetness evaporated, replaced by a steely glare. Sir, she said, her voice now carrying a clear threat, if you refuse to cooperate, I will have to call the captain. The confrontation had been set in motion. The pieces were on the board. Carol, however, had no idea she was playing chess with a grandmaster. She thought she was just removing an obstacle. She had no way of knowing she was about to ground the entire airline. The threat of calling the captain hung in the air, a deliberate escalation designed to intimidate. In the post-9/11 world of air travel, the phrase refuse to cooperate was a loaded one, capable of turning a seating dispute into a federal issue. Julian knew this. Carol knew he knew this. It was a power play, plain and simple. You are welcome to call the captain, Julian replied, his composure a stark contrast to Carol's rising agitation. I would be happy to show him my boarding pass and have him confirm the passenger manifest. I'm sure he can resolve this clerical error in a matter of moments. He refused to be baited into raising his voice. He knew the script. A black man getting loud on an airplane was a one-way ticket to handcuffs. His power lay in his unshakable calm, in his absolute certainty of his right to be there. Carol's lips thinned into a bloodless line. She turned on her heel and marched toward the cockpit, her movements stiff with indignation. Mr. Davenport hovered awkwardly in the aisle, looking increasingly uncomfortable as the silent judgment of the other passengers settled upon the scene. A woman in seat 3B, a well-known actress named Amelia Sterling, pointedly put on her noise-canceling headphones but kept her eyes fixed on Julian, a flicker of sympathy in her gaze. A few minutes later, Carol returned, followed by a man with weary eyes and captain's epaulets on his shoulders. Captain Thomas Riley looked like a man who had flown 1,000 red-eyes and had zero patience for cabin drama. He didn't want a problem. He wanted an on-time departure. Sir, Captain Riley began, his voice a tired baritone. My lead attendant tells me there's a dispute over this seat. There is no dispute, Captain, Julian said calmly, finally pulling the printed boarding pass from his seat pocket and holding it up. There is only my assigned seat. Here is my pass. All I have asked is for your attendant to check it against the flight's official manifest. She has refused. The captain glanced at the pass, then at Carol. A flicker of annoyance crossed his face. This should have been a simple 5-second fix. Carol, did you check the manifest in the system? Carol's face flushed a blotchy red. The system has been slow, Captain, but Mr. Davenport is a million-miler, Platinum Premier. There's obviously been a mistake in the computer, and this gentleman is refusing to be reasonable. It was a masterful deflection, painting Julian as the aggressor. But the captain seemed to see through it, at least partially. He sighed, pulling a tablet from the holder by the galley. He tapped on the screen a few times, his brow furrowed. The silence in the cabin was now absolute. Every passenger was pretending not to listen, and every single one was hanging on his next word. Well, the captain said finally, looking up from the screen. He looked at Julian, then at Davenport, then back at Julian. There does appear to be an issue. The system is showing both of you assigned to 2A. It's a classic ghost in the machine. Julian knew this was a lie. A system glitch of that nature in a modern airline reservation platform was almost impossible. More likely, Davenport's high status had allowed his assistant to bump an existing reservation, and the system hadn't fully reconciled the change, leaving Julian's original, valid ticket in place. The captain was looking for the path of least resistance. However, Captain Riley continued, his eyes settling on Julian, we are already behind schedule. We need to resolve this now. Sir, he said to Julian, I need you to take the seat we've offered in premium economy. We can sort out the compensation later. It wasn't a request, it was an order. The captain's authority on an aircraft is absolute. To defy him was to risk being removed from the flight by force. Julian looked at the captain's tired face, at Carol's triumphant smirk, at Davenport's pathetic, averted gaze. He saw the whole broken, biased system coalescing into a single moment of decision. He could argue, he could quote regulations, he could demand to see the system logs, but he knew it would end the same way. The crew would close ranks, the delay would be blamed on him, and he would be the unruly passenger in the incident report. He had lost this battle, but the war was just beginning. With a slow, deliberate grace, Julian Vance began to gather his things. He slid his laptop back into its case. He unplugged his charger. He stood up, his 6 Mark II frame seeming to fill the entire space. He looked directly at Captain Riley. Captain, I want to be perfectly clear, he said, his voice low and resonant, carrying to every seat in the cabin. I am moving under duress. I am deplaning not because I accept this decision, but because you have left me with no other option that does not involve law enforcement. You are making a mistake. Then he turned his gaze to Carol, whose smirk had been replaced by a look of alarm. The other passengers were now openly staring, their sympathies clearly shifting. And you, he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, have just become the most expensive employee this airline has ever had. He didn't wait for a response. He reached up, opened the overhead bin, and retrieved his briefcase. As he turned to walk down the aisle, he locked eyes for a moment with Amelia Sterling. She gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod of support. The walk back through the rest of the plane was a calculated humiliation, a modern-day walk of shame. He passed through the business class cabin, then the bustling premium economy section he had been offered as a consolation prize, and finally through the cramped rows of economy. Every eye was on him, the well-dressed black man being ejected from first class. Whispers and assumptions followed him like a vapor trail. He kept his head high, his expression unreadable, his stride steady. As he reached the jet bridge, he stepped aside to let a family with young children board. The gate agent, a young man named Marcus, looked at him with a mixture of confusion and pity. Sir, is there a problem? There was, Julian said, handing Marcus his boarding pass. Ascendair has a problem. My name is Julian Vance. Please note in your records that I was involuntarily denied boarding from my confirmed paid-for seat 2A on flight AA-121. And please book me on the next available flight to London, on any airline except this one. Marcus's eyes widened as he scanned the boarding pass and saw the name. He knew who Julian Vance was. Nexus Dynamics was one of the airport's biggest corporate clients. "Mr. Vance, sir, I can call a supervisor." "That won't be necessary, Marcus," Julian said, a surprising kindness in his voice. "This is no longer your problem to solve." He stepped out of the jet bridge and back into the terminal. He walked to a quiet corner of the gate area, pulled out his state-of-the-art smartphone, and made his first call. It wasn't to his lawyer or his publicist. It was to his chief financial officer, David Smith. "David," he said, his voice devoid of all emotion, "it's Julian. I need you to get Anya Sharma from legal on the line with us. Now, I want you to pull up our corporate contract with Ascendair. Every last page of it." There was a pause on the other end. "Julian, is everything okay? You're supposed to be in the air." Julian looked out the terminal window at the massive Boeing 707, the very plane where he had just been systematically stripped of his dignity. "Our plans have changed, David," he said, the cold crystalline anger in his chest now forged into a diamond-hard resolve. "And so have Ascendair's. As of this moment, I want you to find the termination clause. We are freezing every dollar of that budget, every single cent." The Nexus Dynamics headquarters in downtown Manhattan was a cathedral of glass, steel, and silent efficiency. By the time Julian's car pulled up to the curb, having sped back from JFK, the building was already humming with a controlled fury. David Smith, the company's razor-sharp CFO, and Anya Sharma, its formidable general counsel, were waiting for him in the executive boardroom on the 80th floor. The panoramic view of the city skyline seemed to mock the ugliness of the incident that had brought them here. David, a numbers prodigy who saw the world in spreadsheets and balance sheets, had the contract projected onto the massive 16K screen that dominated one wall. Anya, a woman whose calm demeanor belied a litigator's mind that could dissect legal arguments with surgical precision, stood beside it, a tablet in her hand. "Walk me through it again, Julian," Anya said, her voice steady. "Every detail, from the moment the flight attendant approached you." Julian recounted the events without emotion, stripping them down to the bare facts. The initial request, the mention of Mr. Davenport's status, the offer of a downgrade, the refusal to check the manifest, the captain's intervention, and the final humiliating exit. He spoke like an engineer describing a system failure, which in his mind is exactly what it was. A failure of process, of decency, of a brand's promise to its customer. When he finished, the room was silent for a long moment. David was the first to speak, his voice tight. "A $250 travel voucher. They offered you a voucher for being kicked out of a $10,000 seat." "It wasn't about the money, David, and you know it," Julian said, finally allowing a hint of weariness to enter his voice. "It was about the principle." Anya nodded, her eyes fixed on the screen. "He's right. This wasn't a customer service issue. This was a violation. The contract is our leverage." She highlighted a section on the screen. Article 7, Section B, the Corporate Service Level Agreement. "We negotiated this ourselves 3 years ago. It guarantees our employees, particularly our executives, a certain standard of service, safety, and respect. It contains clauses against discrimination and arbitrary denial of service. They are in flagrant breach." David chimed in, pointing to another document he had pulled up. "And here's the financial leverage. Our annual spend with Ascendair for the last fiscal year was $123 million. That's not just executive travel. That's flights for our 5,000 consultants globally. It's our high-priority cargo and logistics. It's our corporate event bookings. We are, and I have the data to confirm it, their single largest corporate account worldwide." There it was, the guillotine. Ascendair had spent years and millions of dollars courting and servicing the Nexus Dynamics account. It was a flagship partnership they boasted about in their shareholder reports. And one flight attendant, on one flight, had just jeopardized the entire relationship. "What are our options, Anya?" Julian asked, his gaze fixed on the Ascendair logo on the contract. "We have a few," she said, switching to a new screen. "Option 1. We can sue for breach of contract. It would be a long, drawn-out legal battle. We'd likely win, but it would be costly and time-consuming." She paused. Option 2, we can go public. Release a statement, let the court of public opinion handle it. Risky. It could look like a billionaire complaining about his seat and backfire. Then she smiled, a thin, dangerous smile. Or option 3, we can activate Article 15, remediation and suspension. The contract states that in the event of a material breach of the service level agreement, Nexus Dynamics reserves the right to suspend all payments and service bookings, pending a satisfactory remediation, which must be addressed by their C-level executive team within 10 business days. This was the clause Julian had been waiting for. It wasn't a full termination, not yet. It was a suspension. It was a shot across the bow. It was freezing the flow of money so completely that it would trigger alarms in every department at Ascendair, from accounting to sales to executive leadership. We're not just suspending payments for future bookings, Julian said, his voice hardening. I want every outstanding invoice frozen, every payment currently being processed, halted. I want their accounts receivable department to see a $120 million hole appear where our name used to be. David Smith's eyes lit up. This was a language he understood. I can make that happen within the hour. It will require a full system lockdown of our payment gateway to their accounts. It will be noisy. Good, Julian said. Anya, I want you to draft the letter. It should be addressed directly to Mark Gallagher, their CEO, no one else. State the facts of the incident on flight AO-121. Name the flight attendant, Carol. Name the captain, Thomas Riley. Cite Article 7, Section B as the breach, and formally invoke our right of suspension under Article 15. Make it cold, professional, and absolutely non-negotiable. Anya was already typing on her tablet, her fingers flying across the screen. Consider it done. It will be on his desk by the close of business today. Julian stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the city below. The anger was still there, but it was now channeled, focused into a singular, powerful weapon. This was no longer just about him. It was about every person of color who had ever been made to feel small, who had been passed over, who had been told they didn't belong. Nexus Dynamics had the power to enforce consequences on a scale most people could only dream of, and he would be damned if he didn't use it. One more thing, he said, turning back to his team. I don't want this leaked, not by us. I want Ascendair to feel the financial shockwave first. I want them to be confused. I want them to scramble for an explanation before Anya's letter even arrives. I want them to understand that this came from inside their own house. David and Anya nodded in unison. The plan was set. The corporate juggernaut of Nexus Dynamics had been awakened and was now pointed directly at the heart of Ascendair. The order was given. The button was pushed. And somewhere in a server farm in Virginia, a cascade of digital commands began, instantly freezing a $120 million pipeline of revenue. The guillotine had fallen. Ascendair just didn't know it yet. At the Ascendair global headquarters near Dallas-Fort Worth, the first sign of trouble wasn't a letter or a phone call, but a single blinking red alert on a monitor in the accounts receivable department. A junior analyst named Kevin stared at his screen, perplexed. The daily automated payment transfer from Nexus Dynamics, a massive sum that was as reliable as the sunrise, had failed. He ran the diagnostic. The payment hadn't just failed, it had been actively rejected by the source. He tried a manual push. Rejected again. He flagged it for his supervisor, who flagged it for her director. Within an hour, the anomaly had traveled up the chain of command like a virus. By mid-afternoon, the vice president of corporate accounts was on the phone with his counterpart at Nexus, only to be met with a polite but firm stone wall. All inquiries regarding the Ascendair account are being handled by our general counsel's office. A formal communication is forthcoming. This was corporate speak for a catastrophe. The news finally reached the 50th floor, the opulent executive suite occupied by Ascendair's CEO, Mark Gallagher. Gallagher was a man molded by the brash, cost-cutting, union-busting ethos of the airline industry of the 1990s. He saw passengers not as guests, but as self-loading cargo. He viewed customer service as a cost center, and his airline's culture reflected his philosophy. He was arrogant, dismissive, and utterly convinced of his own indispensability. When his executive VP of sales, a perpetually nervous man named Bill, delivered the news that Nexus Dynamics had frozen all payments, Gallagher barely looked up from signing a stack of documents. "It's a glitch, Bill," he said, waving a dismissive hand. "A technical error. Tell it to get on the phone with their IT. Handle it." "Mark, I don't think it's a glitch," Bill stammered. "Their CFO's office is routing us to their lawyers. They said a formal communication is on its way. That's not what you say for a server issue." Gallagher finally put down his pen and leaned back in his Eames chair, annoyed. "So they're playing hardball. What is it this time? They want a bigger discount on their cargo rates, an upgrade to their corporate travel perks? Fine. Figure out what they want, give them a 5% concession, and get the money flowing again. Don't waste my time with this." This was how Mark Gallagher operated. Every problem could be solved by either bullying someone or throwing a small amount of money at them. He failed to grasp that a fundamental shift had occurred. He was bringing a knife to a nuclear war. Late that afternoon, the formal communication arrived. It was not an email that could be ignored, but a priority courier delivery that had to be signed for. Anya Sharma's letter was a masterpiece of cold, legal fury. It laid out the events on Flight AA-121 in excruciating, dispassionate detail. It named the employees involved. It cited the specific articles of their multi-million-dollar contract that had been breached. And it concluded with the chillingly simple statement that all financial activity was suspended until a C-level remediation was proposed and accepted. Gallagher read the letter, his face slowly turning a shade of crimson. He wasn't horrified by the injustice done to Julian Vance. He was enraged by the audacity of it. "Are you kidding me?" he roared, slamming the letter down on his desk. Bill, who had been waiting nervously outside his office, flinched. "All of this? $120 million? Over one passenger getting moved? One?" He stormed around his office, a caged bull. "Some CEO I've never heard of gets his feelings hurt by a flight attendant and decides to blow up our biggest corporate account? Unbelievable. This is blackmail." "His name is Julian Vance, Mark," Bill offered weakly. "Nexus Dynamics. He's not just some CEO, he's the CEO. He basically invented the modern logistics software we use." "I don't care if he's Steve Jobs reincarnated," Gallagher bellowed. "This is a ridiculous overreaction. Get our legal team on this. Threaten a countersuit for breach of contract. This Vance character will back down. They always do." He was still operating from the old playbook. He believed Ascendair was the monolith, the indispensable partner. He couldn't conceive of a world where Nexus Dynamics didn't need his airline more than his airline needed their money. Meanwhile, a parallel process had begun. Following standard procedure for any in-flight incident involving a confrontation, Captain Riley had filed a report. Carol had also filed her own, heavily biased version of events, painting Julian as agitated and non-compliant. These reports landed in the inbox of a mid-level manager in the customer relations department. The manager, following a flowchart, categorized the incident as a seating dispute with involuntary deplaning. The system automatically generated a response. 2 days after the incident, as Julian, Anya, and David were mapping out their next move, an email arrived in Julian's inbox. It was from customer.relations@ascendair.com. "Dear valued customer, we are sorry to hear that your recent travel experience with Ascendair did not meet your expectations. We understand that seating issues can be frustrating, and we apologize for any inconvenience this may have caused. Our records indicate that our crew acted in accordance with FAA regulations to ensure an on-time departure. As a gesture of our goodwill, we have credited your account with a $400 travel voucher for future use on Ascendair. We value your business and hope to have the opportunity to welcome you aboard again soon. Sincerely, the Ascendair customer experience team." Julian read the email, then read it again. He forwarded it to Anya and David without comment. In the boardroom, the three of them looked at the email projected on the screen, the boilerplate language, the paltry voucher, insultingly larger than the first but still a pittance, the subtle blaming of him for the delay, the complete and utter failure to comprehend the gravity of the situation. It was corporate arrogance distilled into a 120-word email. David Smith started to laugh, a dry, humorless sound. They think they can solve this with a $400 voucher. They think this is about a flight. Anya Sharma, however, was not laughing. This is good for us, she said, her voice sharp. This is their official response. It's dismissive, inadequate, and constitutes a failure to remediate under Article 15. They've just handed us the moral high ground on a silver platter. Julian stared at the email, a deep, profound calm settling over him. Mark Gallagher and his entire corporate culture had underestimated him. They hadn't just insulted him as a passenger. They had fundamentally misjudged him as an adversary. They thought he was a disgruntled customer. They were about to learn he was a force of nature. While Ascendair's executives were congratulating themselves on handling the situation, a young aviation blogger named Ben Collins, who ran a popular site called Skies and Lies, received an anonymous tip. The tip was from a gate agent at JFK named Marcus, who couldn't shake the image of the dignified CEO being forced off the flight. The tip was simple. Look into why Julian Vance was kicked off AA-121 on Tuesday. The airline is trying to bury it. Ben Collins, smelling a story, started digging. He had sources inside the airline industry. He made a few calls. He messaged a flight attendant he knew who was friends with someone who had worked the flight. Bit by bit, the story began to take shape. And as Ascendair slept, smug in their corporate bubble, the spark of a media firestorm was about to be lit. The deafening silence of their arrogance was about to be shattered by a roar of public outrage. Ben Collins posted his article on Skies and Lies at 5 a.m. Eastern Time on Friday, 3 days after the incident. The headline was explosive. Billionaire black CEO forcibly removed from first class on Ascendair for white passenger. Sources say Airline ignored his valid ticket. The article was meticulously researched. Ben had cross-referenced the flight number and time. He had the names Julian Vance and Richard Davenport, though he used initials to avoid immediate legal trouble. He had an anonymous quote from a cabin crew source confirming the confrontation with a lead attendant named Carol. Most damningly, he had a quote from a first-class passenger who had witnessed the entire event. That passenger was Amelia Sterling, the Oscar-winning actress, who had her publicist provide a statement. I witnessed a gentleman being treated in a manner that was deeply unprofessional and unsettling. He was calm and respectful, yet he was removed from a seat that was clearly his. It was a failure of common decency on the part of the airline crew. By 7 a.m., the article was the #1 post on Reddit's R news section. By 8 a.m., the hashtag #FlyWithDignity was trending on Twitter, alongside Nar Boycott Ascendair. The story had everything for the modern viral news cycle: race, privilege, corporate malfeasance, and a celebrity witness. At the Nexus Dynamics headquarters, Julian's communications team watched the storm break with a mixture of awe and trepidation. They hadn't leaked the story, just as Julian had ordered. But now that it was out, they had to manage it. The narrative is on our side, said Maya, his head of communications. Vance is being portrayed as the stoic victim of corporate prejudice. Sterling's statement is the accelerant. We need to decide how to respond. Julian, who had been watching the news coverage on the boardroom screen, was silent for a moment. Cable news channels were already running with the story. Financial news outlets were connecting the dots, speculating if this incident was related to the unexplained financial dispute between Nexus and Ascendair that had started to leak from sources in the financial world. We say nothing, Julian decided. Our silence is more powerful. Anya's letter and the frozen budget are our official statements. Let the public and the press do the work for us. Let Ascendair choke on their own arrogance. And choke they did. At the Ascendair headquarters, it was pure pandemonium. Mark Gallagher had woken up to 100 missed calls and a stock price that was beginning to nosedive in pre-market trading. He stormed into the office, his face purple with rage. Who is Amelia Sterling? And why is she talking to some damn blogger? He screamed at his PR team. Get her on the phone. Make her retract it. We can't, Mark, said his terrified head of public relations. Her publicist says the statement stands. And the story is everywhere now. The New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, CNN, they've all picked it up. The phones in Ascendair's customer service centers were ringing off the hook, not with booking requests, but with cancellations. Corporate clients, spooked by the Nexus Dynamics situation and the ensuing PR nightmare, were calling to review their contracts. Social media was a battlefield, and Ascender was losing disastrously. Memes of Carol the flight attendant as a villain were going viral. The company's attempts to post generic apologies on Twitter were met with thousands of derisive and angry comments. By noon, Ascender's stock, ticker ASC, was down 8%. By the closing bell, it had plunged a catastrophic 15%, wiping over $400 million from the company's market capitalization. The $120 million budget Julian had frozen now seemed like a quaint opening salvo. This was a full-scale assault on their brand, their reputation, and their financial stability. Gallagher was forced to call an emergency meeting of the board of directors. The mood in the room was grim. The board, composed of seasoned investors and industry veterans, was not interested in Gallagher's blustering excuses. "Mark, what in God's name happened?" asked one of the board members, a formidable woman named Eleanor Vance, no relation to Julian. "We have a brand crisis, a stock collapse, and our largest client has frozen us out. All stemming from one seating dispute. Explain it." Gallagher tried to spin the story, painting Julian Vance as an entitled tech billionaire trying to bully the airline. He downplayed Carol's role and emphasized the captain's authority. It didn't work. "So your official response to the CEO of your biggest account, after your crew publicly humiliated him, was a generic email and a $400 voucher?" Eleanor asked, her voice dripping with incredulity. "Is that correct?" Gallagher could only nod, his usual bluster deflating under the weight of his own incompetence. "Mark, this isn't about one seat anymore," another board member interjected. "This is about a systemic failure of judgment at every level, from the flight attendant to the captain to your office. You didn't see this as a crisis. You saw it as a nuisance. And your arrogance is now costing our shareholders hundreds of millions of dollars." The pressure was mounting, not just from the board, but from the outside. The flight attendants union, initially defensive, started to distance themselves from Carol after seeing the sheer toxicity of the public backlash. Pilots' associations quietly grumbled about captains being put in impossible positions by poorly trained cabin crew. The digital wildfire was burning down everything Mark Gallagher had built. He had dismissed Julian Vance as a minor irritant, but Vance had become a symbol. He was the catalyst for a global conversation about dignity, respect, and the casual, everyday racism that so often goes unchallenged. Ascender had provided the spark, but Julian's quiet, powerful resolve had fanned it into an inferno. Late that night, Julian stood by the window of his office, watching the city lights. His phone buzzed. It was a text from an old mentor, a retired general and now a board member at several Fortune 500 companies. The text read, "Julian, I'm hearing chatter. The Ascender board is in revolt. They're looking for a way out. You didn't just freeze their budget. You've put the CEO's head on the chopping block. Well played." Julian didn't reply. He simply watched the lights, a silent victor in a battle he never wanted to fight, but one he was determined to win. The storm he had unleashed was now self-sustaining, and it was about to wash away everyone who stood in its path. The media firestorm was no longer just about a single incident. It had become an investigation into the very soul of Ascender. Journalists and internet sleuths began digging, and the first thread they pulled was Carol Peterson. Convinced she was the victim, Carol agreed to an exclusive interview on a primetime cable news show, hoping to tell her side of the story. It was a catastrophic mistake. Under the bright lights, her practice story of a difficult passenger and following protocol began to crumble. She came across as defensive, cold, and utterly lacking in empathy. But the real damage happened while she was still on air. Amateur researchers, armed with nothing but her name, had delved into her social media history. Her supposedly private Facebook and Instagram accounts were a cesspool of thinly veiled bigotry. They found shared posts mocking diversity initiatives, likes on anti-immigration pages, and a comment under a news article about a Black Lives Matter protest that simply said, "thugs and criminals." Screenshots flooded Twitter in real time. The cable news host, being fed the information through his earpiece, pivoted his questions. "Ms. Peterson, a post from your Facebook account from 2022 is now circulating, where you seem to agree with a comment calling affirmative action reverse racism." Can you explain that? Carol's face went pale. She stammered. She denied. She claimed she was hacked. But the damage was done. She had exposed herself not as a dedicated employee enforcing rules, but as a person with a clear, demonstrable bias. By the time the interview was over, her career was not just over, it was incinerated. Ascendair fired her the next morning, citing a violation of their social media policy, a convenient excuse to cut loose the woman who had become the public face of their crisis. The next domino to fall was Richard Davenport, the man in seat 2A. He had remained silent, hoping the storm would pass him by. But in the digital age, there is no hiding. A passenger on the flight took a surreptitious photo of him settling into his seat after Julian had deplaned. The photo, blurry but clear enough, was posted online. Facial recognition software in a few dedicated online communities identified him within hours. Richard Davenport, it turned out, was a senior partner at a major lobbying firm in Washington, D.C., a firm that, as journalists quickly discovered, had been lobbying the Department of Transportation on behalf of Ascendair for years. This revelation added a new, sordid layer to the story. Was he just a Platinum Premier member? Or did the crew know exactly who he was, a man with political influence over their industry, and chose to placate him at any cost? The narrative shifted from casual racism to calculated cronyistic corruption. Davenport's firm was forced to issue a statement, and he was promptly encouraged to take an extended leave of absence. His reputation was left in tatters, but the most devastating blow came from within Ascendair itself. A data analyst in the airline's operations department, a young black woman named Keisha, had been following the story with a growing sense of anger. She had long been troubled by some of the company's practices, particularly the vaguely named involuntary passenger reaccommodation protocol. Spurred on by the public outcry, she decided to do some digging in the company's internal servers during her off hours. What she found was horrifying. She analyzed 5 years of data related to flight upgrades, downgrades, and involuntary removals from flights due to overbooking or seating disputes. The pattern was undeniable and statistically significant. Passengers with non-Western sounding names were 60% more likely to be involuntarily downgraded. Black passengers, particularly black men, were nearly twice as likely as white passengers in the same fare class to be targeted for reaccommodation. The data told a story not of isolated incidents, but of systemic, baked-in institutional bias. The algorithm the airline used to flag passengers for removal during overbooking situations was weighted with factors that indirectly discriminated against minorities and lower-income travelers. It was a digital reflection of the company's prejudiced culture. Keisha knew she was holding a corporate smoking gun. Terrified but resolute, she downloaded the data onto a secure flash drive. She contacted Ben Collins of the Skies and Lies blog, the man who had broken the original story. They met discreetly and she handed over the data, along with an internal memo from a VP of operations from 3 years prior. The memo acknowledged the unfortunate statistical skew in the reaccommodation data, but concluded that fixing it would be too costly and disruptive to our streamlined boarding process. Ben Collins knew this was the kill shot. He worked with a data visualization team and published his follow-up piece. The headline was simple and brutal. Ascendair's secret algorithm. Data proves airline systematically targets minority passengers. The article included charts, graphs, and the full, damning internal memo. It was no longer a story about one man's experience. It was a class action lawsuit waiting to happen. It was a story that would attract the attention of the Department of Transportation, the Department of Justice. For the Ascendair board, this was the final straw. The company wasn't just in a PR crisis. It was facing potential federal investigations, crippling lawsuits, and a brand so toxic it might never recover. The rot started at the top. Mark Gallagher's cost-cutting, dehumanizing corporate philosophy had created the conditions for this disaster. His arrogance had fanned the flames. Now he had to be sacrificed. Eleanor Vance called an emergency board meeting for the following morning. The agenda had only one item: a vote of no confidence in the chief executive officer, Mark Gallagher. The unraveling was complete. The lies had been exposed, the biases laid bare, and the hard karma that Julian Vance had set in motion was about to claim its biggest victim. The boardroom on the 50th floor of the Ascendair headquarters felt less like a center of power and more like a funeral parlor. Mark Gallagher sat at the head of the table, his face a pallid mask of defeat. The bravado was gone, replaced by the stunned silence of a man who had lost control of his kingdom. Eleanor Vance conducted the proceedings with grim efficiency. "The evidence is overwhelming," she said, her voice leaving no room for argument. "The data leak, the Department of Transportation launching an official inquiry, the stock price in freefall. This board has lost all confidence in your ability to lead this company out of the crisis you created." The vote was a mere formality. It was unanimous. Mark Gallagher was terminated, effective immediately. His 9-figure golden parachute was clawed back, citing a moral turpitude clause in his contract related to gross mismanagement leading to catastrophic brand damage. He was escorted from the building by security, a final, ignominious end to his reign of arrogance. In his place, the board appointed an interim CEO, Eleanor Vance herself. Her first act was not to issue a press release or speak to investors. It was to place a direct call to Julian Vance. "Mr. Vance," she began, her voice crisp and respectful, "this is Eleanor Vance, the interim CEO of Ascendair. First, on behalf of this entire company, I want to offer you an apology that is direct, unconditional, and long overdue. What happened to you was unacceptable, and it has exposed a deep sickness within our corporate culture. I am calling not to make excuses, but to ask for your help in curing it." Julian, sitting in his own boardroom with Anya and David, listened intently. This was the moment he had been waiting for. Not the revenge, but the reckoning, the opportunity for real change. "I'm listening, Ms. Vance," he said. "I have read your company's mission statement," Eleanor continued. "Nexus Dynamics is about creating efficient, ethical, and intelligent systems. That is what Ascendair desperately needs. The financial leverage you have is clear, but I'm more interested in your intellectual capital. I am not asking you to simply unfreeze our account. I am proposing a partnership. I want to hire Nexus Dynamics to conduct a root and branch overhaul of our systems, from our booking algorithms to our customer service training protocols. We need to rebuild trust, and frankly, we don't know how. You do." She paused, letting the audacious proposal sink in. "We will pay your standard rate, and the first line item in the new budget will be a multi-million-dollar fund managed jointly by our companies, dedicated to diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives and training for all 80,000 of our employees. We want to turn this disaster into a model for the entire industry." Anya and David looked at Julian, stunned. This was a move no one had anticipated. Eleanor Vance wasn't just surrendering, she was inviting her conqueror in to help rebuild the city. Julian considered the offer. He could have simply bankrupted them, taken his business to a competitor, and savored the victory. But that would be a hollow win. It would punish the crime, but it wouldn't prevent the next one. This was a chance to fix the system itself, to use his power not just for retribution, but for reconstruction. "Mrs. Vance," Julian said, a new tone in his voice, "on 2 conditions. First, the results of the audit and the changes we implement must be made public. Transparency is non-negotiable. Second, I want Captain Thomas Riley to be retrained, not fired. He made a bad call under pressure, but unlike Carol Peterson, he wasn't motivated by malice, but by a flawed corporate policy that prioritizes on-time departures over human dignity. He needs to learn, not just be discarded." "Agreed," Eleanor said without hesitation. "To both." And so the great freeze began to thaw. The $120 million budget was not just unfrozen, it was repurposed. A significant portion was funneled into the new joint initiative, the Ascend project. Teams from Nexus Dynamics descended upon the airline, not as adversaries, but as partners. They redesigned the algorithms, rebuilt the training modules, and implemented new, transparent customer service protocols. 6 months later, Julian Vance once again found himself at JFK, heading to London. He walked down the jet bridge to an Ascendair flight. He was holding a boarding pass for seat 2A. As he stepped onto the plane, the lead flight attendant, a young, sharp-eyed man, greeted him with a genuine smile. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Vance. It's an honor to have you with us today." As Julian settled into the familiar leather of seat 2A, he noticed a small engraved plaque on the wall next to the seat. It was new. It read, "The Vance Principle, every passenger, every flight, with dignity." It was a small gesture, but it was a symbol of a monumental shift. His journey had started with a quiet, ugly act of humiliation. It had led to a corporate war, a public reckoning, and finally to a new beginning. He hadn't just gotten his seat back. He had ensured that no one else would have to lose theirs for the same unjust reasons again. He opened his laptop not to work, but to look at the Ascend project's latest progress report. The flight plan had changed for good. And that is how a single act of defiance, backed by immense leverage and unwavering principle, did more than just win an apology. It forced an entire corporation to confront the poison within its own culture and begin the hard work of healing. Julian Vance's story serves as a powerful reminder that sometimes the most effective way to fight a broken system isn't to shout, but to find its main power switch and, with cold, calculated precision, turn it off. This story, while a dramatization, is inspired by countless real-life incidents where people have been mistreated and their dignity ignored. It shows that when power is used not just for personal revenge, but for systemic change, the results can be truly transformative. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to the channel for more stories of justice and consequence. What would you have done in Julian's position? Let us know in the comments below.